Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to introduce you to the field of genetic criticism, a field of literary studies concerned with empirically studying the text as a historically contingent artifact. I'm going to be explaining some of the traditions in literary studies that this is coming out of, and some of the contentions, quips, and theorizations that it makes along the way. At the heart of genetic criticism is the understanding that theoretical frameworks themselves presuppose some aspects of the object that they study. So literary studies supposes some things about the literary text. It supposes some ideas of finality, that, for example, when I have a text and it is published, this is the final edition and this is the one that we read. So it also brings into question a number of aspects of publishing and of consumership and readership and writing. And genetic criticism wants to look at the text and really deconstruct the idea of the text as such. Instead of looking at, for example, Finnegan's Wake as the text, the 1939 edition that has been printed, instead of seeing that as the text, we see it as a text. And this is in line with an observation made by Gilles Deleuze, who says that we need to shift from talking of the world in essences to historically contingent processes, which allow for multiplicity instead of reducing things to singular unitary essences. If we look at the way that Plato talks about ontology, for example, everything has identity because of its membership in a formal category. It is a membership of, and it participates in the form of bookness, of humanness, of whiteness, of orangeness, of scratchiness. Any of these qualities or things, they have a pure, unmediated, unpredicated form as such, the thing as such, the Ding an sich, as Kant calls it, the thing in itself, which is. And somehow particular things interact with that general formal essence, and by that nature, by being a member of a general set, they gain their identity. But there are a number of problems that Deleuze identifies with this, chiefly being that it presupposes that unity pre-exists multiplicity, that multiplicity can furthermore be reduced back to unity, and that unity and systematic reduction should be our ideal in theory. And we see this mirrored in a history of literary studies that has been obsessed with an essentialist understanding of textuality. That there is the text, and we want to try to get back to the text. We understand that texts have to be written, they have to be copied, they have to be disseminated, and they have to be read. And there are all sorts of contingencies that arise here. But the idea, and we can think of this in the paradigmatic case of biblical studies, of the idea that there was an original text which was then bastardized as it was disseminated, as it was copied, and as it was interpreted. And through a number of careful empirical channels, we can get back to an original text. We can get back to some kind of critical edition, where we can collate all the most relevant manuscripts and we can combine them into a most authoritative edition. And behind this idea of an authoritative edition is the idea that closer to the original, we get more authority. And tied up with this is, of course, the idea of the originality of authorial intention. Going back to Finnegan's Wake, for example, this is the perspective that would say that to get a proper edition of Finnegan's Wake and the proper interpretation and reading of Finnegan's Wake, we need to go back to the original text. We need to get away from alternate interpretations or ones that are more risky, and we need to get back to what Joyce really had in mind. And this really is a crucial term here. This is a sort of begging the question, a sort of no true Scotsman, where we say, no, that's not a really accurate version of Finnegan's Wake. And we sort of hierarchize our hermeneutic, right? But genetic criticism has a number of contentions with this essentialist understanding of the text, that, for example, we can get back to what the biblical authors really had in mind. They say that, well, if we understand and take the postmodernists seriously, then the author's presence in the text is not experienced as an authentic presence, but rather as an effect. So, right, when I read Finnegan's Wake, I don't get Joyce unmediated. I get him mediated through the words that he chooses, through the form that he chooses, through the intertextual references which he hearkens to, right? All of these give me the sense of some author behind the words, some sort of persona that persists beyond the contingencies of this text, and somehow is therefore master over the text. But someone like Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida come along and they say, well, because of this, the author is nothing but an effect. And the deconstructionists like Barthes and Derrida take this to the extreme, and they say that, well, there is no outside of the text. So all textuality is a series of deferred effects in which all we get is the presentation of wholeness, of essential unity, for example. The idea that this is the text, the most authoritative text, or that I'm really getting Joyce's voice. And the genetic critics say, well, if we want to really understand the notion of the author, for example, we can't just look at the sort of final curated instantiation complete with all of its gaps that we get in the final text, but we need to go back into the empirical record of the text's composition. We need to understand its genealogy, and we need to look at notebooks. We need to look at secondary material, which it is intertextually referencing. We need to look at typescripts, and we need to look at letters and correspondences, and we need to look for every possible iteration of the text, which in effect deconstructs the idea of the text as such. We get instead a historically contingent genealogy, which is doing, and this is coming from Nietzsche's genealogical method, where he says that, okay, I take something absolute and I show that it has historically developed, that it is not absolute, but rather is relative to a particular tradition. And this rids us of essentialist thinking, because instead of talking about the Finnegan's Wake, we might ask, well, what version of Finnegan's Wake is this? And most Finnegan's Wake copies today are based on the original 1939 manuscript, but you've had some Wake scholars recently, I think in 2014, Penguin came out with an updated, revised Finnegan's Wake, which I've voiced my concerns with before, but that would be an example of, for example, trying to go back to some original, trying to amend and come to some final text. But there's a problem here, and this is often something that we see in, for example, if I just say that this is the most authoritative version of Finnegan's Wake, I'm assuming that there is some sort of teleology behind the writing process, that it develops progressively in a sort of upward manner towards some state of perfection. And the more final, the more perfect, because it has had more time for the author to intervene and refine. But one of the things about genetic criticism is that it no longer understands the author as master or dictator over the text, but themselves contingently involved in the writing process, that the process entails that their writings go beyond them. You know, when I interpret Finnegan's Wake, Joyce is not here looking over my shoulder, and he has provided some sort of formal parameters in the text, a la someone like Wolfgang Ise's theory, but nevertheless, Joyce is not literally there. If anything, he's there in the sort of Derridian trace sense. And the text is really a constant trace. Think of like trace fossils in archaeology, right? We're sort of doing an archaeology of the text in the Foucauldian sense, looking at this as a historically contingent artifact. And in order to come up with interpretations, we need to see not the final text, but rather the changes that happen between each iteration of the text. So one of the really fundamental aspects of genetic criticism is seeing the text as revisable and iterative and differential, and also arbitrary. And these last two are coming from Saussure and Derrida. that language and signification is arbitrary and differential. Arbitrary because there is no absolute ground giving signs their meaning. They only gain meaning relative to other signs in a discourse which they relate to and they differ from. So any sense of presence is really only deferred to another thing, right? The sense of an authentic Joyce happens precisely because he's not here, because he's taken the time to refine his voice beyond his sort of natural voice. And as we see in the history of, for example, the development of Finnegan's Wake, we see a series of iterative revisions, which often self-reflexively are talking to one another because the artist themselves is conscious. And as they're writing, that consciousness can be seen in the way that the textual record responds to itself. So genetic criticism is coming from a number of, late modernist and post-structuralist theory, and also taking into account a historical empirical understanding of textual materiality. A great kind of case study for understanding the relevance of textual materiality to the writing process and to the text as such is Daniel Ferré's Genetic Joyce, where he talks about the way that in the drafting process in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, for example, sometimes the ink choice will make various changes possible. It will mean that certain things will bleed through the page, and the sort of bifurcated nature of the page and of the writing process and of the tools used allows for certain chance happenings to occur that Joyce will actually incorporate into the text. So we see in genetic criticism the way that the writing process takes on a personal and contingent sort of experimentality. We see that the author is, just like any interpreter, not master over the text, but that the text always disseminates outwards beyond any one point and shows its multiplicity, and shows that we cannot reduce it to any one point, either earlier or later. We cannot go back to, for example, the first sketches of Finnegan's Wake, such as the Tristan und Isolde sketch, because it looks nothing like the final text. It is completely different formally, stylistically, intertextually, visually. All of it is completely different, and yet it is part of a genealogy of this text, where text really we see is a sort of generality, a sort of nothing burger of a word that can be used to forestall the deep empirical investigation of textual multiplicity. And genetic criticism really asks us to volley all of the possible resources we have, not with this idea that we might reach some plenitude of the text, but that we might show the inadequacy of any one text to understanding the whole of its genealogical tradition. And by doing that, we don't restore some textual unity, but we can more accurately illustrate the disseminative nature of the textual genealogy. We can show the sort of fulminating, developing processes that are part and parcel of not only writing, but also reading, and also of living itself. We see the text as something living that develops and has a lifetime of its own. And just like people, beyond its sort of empirical death, so to speak, with the death of the author in the literal historical sense, the author lives on in traces, just as the various earlier or later manifestations of the text remain as traces. So this is going to mean that genetic criticism is really, really dense. It is just filled with references to notebooks and typescripts and fair copies and letters and concordances. And all of this is trying to rally together this huge entourage of the history of the text and sort of moving forward this history not as some unitary phenomenon, but as something varied and variegated and constantly different unto itself. So that being said, I hope this helps kind of give you a primer for what genetic criticism is and might motivate you to read some scholarship. It is most well known in Joycean studies, particularly in Wake's studies or Wakean studies, where we're studying Finnegan's Wake, but it has relevance to plenty of other fields. I'm not particularly well versed on any of the other genetic traditions. I'm most interested in Finnegan's Wake and the relevance of genetic criticism to Finnegan's Wake, but you can find it in other places. So maybe go out and see if, for your particular interests, there is some genetic criticism being done. That being said, that is it for this lecture. I hope it's been enjoyable and helped you think about these things. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books like these are not cheap, and I appreciate anything that anyone gives. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.